This is an article that came out in the Tennessee in November 27, 2017. It's a nightmare. Fake opioids pose challenges for law enforcement addiction experts. The latest battle against Tennessee opioid plague is being waged with test tubes and high-tech lab equipment. The state's opioid plague began more than a decade ago with legitimately manufactured pharmaceuticals that were overprescribed, abused, and illicitly bought, shared, or stolen. The problem has since grown to include tinkered versions of the original FDA approved drugs as prescriptions have become harder to obtain. New varieties of these counterfeit drugs, called analogs, are being created faster than addiction treatment experts, death investigators, and state laws can keep up with them. It's a nightmare, said Tommy Farmer, director of the Tennessee Dangerous Drug Task Force. That can shift an oxygen molecule here or a hydrogen group over there, and that slightest shift affects the legality of it from a controlled substance to an unknown, Farmer said. If a synthetic opioid version created illegally isn't included on the state schedules of controlled substances, prosecution does not become problematic, said Ed Ryan, a prosecutor with the Nashville District Attorney's Office. The drugs also pose challenges to medical examiners whose job it is to determine cause of death, said Dr. Hunt, director of William L. Jenkins Forensic Center in Johnson City. Several years ago, the publicly funded facility sent 20% of specimens collected during autopsies of suspected overdose victims to outside laboratories to do more advanced drug screenings that the center is able to do. This year, the center is sending approximately 80%, he said. Even with those outside lab screenings, high-tech labs have not been able to develop fast enough methodologies that can accurately test the quantity and nature of drugs found in victims' body fluids, he said. We're getting a lot of drug cases, and some of them are designer drugs that create a problem in and of themselves. Some are so new that they can't be identified. They can't even identify these drugs. And see, that's why I'm telling you every time, because these drugs come out of China. That's where most of them come out of. They change these drugs very frequently. So by the time they get these drugs in a lab and start trying to figure out what they are, they're already spreading on the streets. So the labs are always lagging behind the newer fentanyl analogs that are hitting the streets. We are getting a lot of drug cases, and some of them are designer drugs that create a problem in themselves. Okay, so those outside testing expenses at about $200 each are borne by taxpayers who foot most of the bill at the state's 5 forensic centers that perform autopsies. So, the taxpayer dime is going towards all of these junkies. It's amazing. You didn't spend a dime on the crack addicts. The influx of illegally manufactured drugs also has left addiction treatment experts in the dark. At laboratory in Brentwood, technicians use high-tech equipment to test blood and urine samples from inpatients at treatment centers around the country. The addiction lab test for about 40 types of fentanyl, the most common synthetic opioid that is finding its way into Tennessee illicit drug market. It's not easy to pinpoint the exact drug version found in body fluids, and the lab is constantly trying to develop tests for drugs that the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration may not have seen yet. We want to get ahead of the curve, said Dr. Howard Taylor, director of toxicology. That's a challenge even for the most sophisticated labs, according to Wesley Gemin, chief pharmacist of Tennessee Opioid Treatment Authority at the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse. Lab testing requires a reference sample to check a substance against. If it's a new analog and there's no reference sample for comparison, Gemin said the state is now trying to be more proactive in anticipating that the pace of a new chemical version of synthetic opioids flood Tennessee will not change. Traditionally, we have been reactive as far as new drugs, Grimman said. State officials are working on language that would criminalize new synthetic opioid variations that have yet to be found in Tennessee, he said. Instead of trying to chase our tail before a fentanyl analog becomes a public health threat, we plan to future proof the law. You know what? It don't matter what laws they got in place. Okay, you put laws in place. How does that stop the people from having access to the drugs out on the street? It does nothing. I hear what he's saying, but it's not going to really do anything.
When a person dies, if they
Okay,
die
we'll
of a
listen to
suspected
this
drug
video.
overdose death, the county medical examiner of that county is to be notified. The county medical examiner can decide to do an autopsy. They can do toxicology testing on their own, or they can simply take from the circumstances of the scene and call it an overdose death. So that has to happen. Then the proper toxicology testing has to be done. We have to know specifically what drugs we're looking for in order to test for those. For example, fentanyl and the synthetic fentanyls need specialized testing, and you have to know that up front when you're ordering the test. Another problem is that there is some stigma associated with overdose deaths. And in a county, if the county medical examiner is familiar with the family or wants to spare them embarrassment, they may put natural causes for that death. And so I think we're probably undercounting opioid overdose deaths. I wouldn't be surprised if it were as much as by a factor of 25%. The scale of the problem is huge, and we don't know what we don't know. So we're trying to gather that data. Another big problem nationwide is that there is a shortage of forensic pathologists who do those autopsies and make those diagnoses. There is a shortage of funding for the medical examiner's offices in order that they can get this specialized toxicology testing performed. So the accuracy of our data is impaired by a lack of funding. This is happening all over the country, and it's happening to persons of every ethnicity, social status, educational status, and it is truly an epidemic affecting the country.
Okay, you hear that. So they will put natural causes on the death certificate, out of the family not being embarrassed by the drug death. In my opinion, when they report, like, for example, 64,000 people died in 2016, I wouldn't be surprised if it's really double that amount. It's probably over 100,000 people, because if they're putting all of these things on death certificates, then you will never get the truth. If they're not putting the actual drug death as the cause of death and as the true reason for why the person died, then those natural causes are not going to be counted as a drug death. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is way bigger than they're telling us. It's a lot of lying and dishonesty going on in this whole thing. So, you're never going to get the truth. So, just always think it's a lot greater and bigger than what they're reporting. Please tell me what you think. Please leave your comment and subscribe. And don't forget to hit on that notification bell. Peace, family.